Welcome to the MedEvidence podcast, hosted by Dr. Michael Koren and Michelle McCormick. MedEvidence, where we help you navigate the real truth behind medical research with both a clinical and research perspective. In this podcast, we'll have discussions with physicians that have extensive experience in patient care and research. How do you know that something works? In medicine, we conduct clinical trials to see if things work. Now, let's get the truth behind the data.
Welcome back to MedEvidence, Truth Behind the Data. We're talking about what to do after a heart attack or stroke with Dr. Michael Koren and Dr. Albert Lopez. And the last segment, gentlemen, was about the stuff we can change, you know, the weight, the walking, the unhealthy diet. But, you know, there's a huge part of our lives that we can't change, you know, what we were kind of born with. Let's talk quickly about the non-modifiable risk factors when it comes to our health.
Well, as physicians, we like to think we can change everything.
Everything, I know.
Unfortunately, to your point, we do have some limitations, although maybe not. Can't
really change who we were born to, right?
One of my favorite lines to tell my patients is that one of the most important things in life is to pick good parents.
Yeah, right.
So and unfortunately,
I feel like I did that for my children.
Well, there you go. Exactly, and the same here.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's a tough thing to do. But of course, that's a non-modifiable risk factor. Your age is a non-modifiable risk factor.
Just a number. Just a number.
Again, but in the modern context, you know, I identify as a 20-year-old.
You know?
So, don't you think?
Yeah, don't you
think my
6-year-old?
Yeah. Don't you think my cardiovascular risk should be like a 20-year-old since I identify as one?
I don't know. Somebody told me the other day that 50 is the new 50. So
okay.
just saying.
Okay. Well, this gets very confusing, but again,
I'm really in trouble.
So the things that are non-modifiable are typically your family, stats, your age, your gender, your ethnicity, and your weather. And the reason I bring up weather.
Change the weather. You got to move to a nice place.
Well, the reason I mention weather is that there's actually a lot of data showing that bad weather can lead to situational stress, and hurricanes that come into our community can raise the heart attack rate. So there's stuff like that we just can't control. We can try to mitigate it by being sensible and by intervening, but we can't actually control the risk factor itself. But we much prefer to talk about things that we can change.
Yes.
And the important thing about the things that you can change is it establishes your risk. So again, if you're high risk because you're older, remember, age is the most important risk factor. Mm-hmm. So a 60-year-old is much more likely to have a heart attack than a 40-year-old, and an 80-year-old is much more likely to have a heart attack than a 60-year-old. And because of that understanding of that risk, we tend to be more aggressive as people get older. Your gender changes the way we approach things because men and women tend to have different presentations. Dr. Lopez was alluding to that. So the typical clutch your chest, choking sensation that needs associated with shortness of breath and sweating that needs to go to the emergency room as a symptom is more typical of a man. And men typically, when they have their first heart attack, tends to be more complete. So the irony of that is that women may have smaller heart attacks to start, but they're more at risk for recurrent heart attacks because they didn't complete the job, if you will, when they damaged the heart the first time. So they may have very, very different symptoms, and awareness of that is important. So again, if you're female and you've had a heart attack, your risk is actually higher than a man for a recurrent heart attack. So that is not something we can change.
And the
but it's something
not to be as good either. They don't do as well long term.
So again, that's not something we can change, but it's awareness that makes us do things a little bit differently.
Right. And family history kind of plays into that a little bit too. If your father or mother had heart disease or a heart attack, your risk is higher.
Well, that's general. But Dr. Lopez and I are actually also working on this specific thing. So we used to just say, okay, your family history is bad. But now we know there are very specific things that cause that family history. For example, you may have a problem called lipoprotein a, which is a genetically mediated dyslipidemia or lipid problem that we couldn't do that much about in the past, but now through research we can do a whole lot for. And so that's changed very, very rapidly and continues to change as we speak, as an example.
So that's when non-modifiable and modifiable kind of, yeah.
Well, even people with familial hypercholesterol and people that have family history of very high cholesterol, you've got to know that because those people have much higher risk. But we can change that risk,
right?
And we have, through research, have great drugs that markedly reduce that cholesterol profile, but also reduce the risk markedly as well. But you've got to know that.
Exactly.
And you've got to check it. You got to know your numbers.
And that's a great example. What we call FH, or familial hypercholesterolemia, is a relatively common genetic problem. The gene incidence is probably between 1 in 250 and 1 in 500 in our community. And there are different forms of FH, or familial hypercholesterolemia. But the key thing there is that those people have been exposed to high cholesterol levels throughout their lives, and they need to be intervened on particularly aggressively. And they're also likely going to need to use multiple drugs. It's very rare that just one drug like a statin will control a patient with FH, and typically they need 2 or 3, even 4 drugs to get their cholesterol under control.
Wow.
But
so that's done. Yeah, so that's an example of not being able to change the non-modifiable risk factor, but that awareness makes a huge difference in our medical approach.
And then what about some of the other therapies that can be used?
So this kind of jumps into specifics. So when we jump into specifics on lipids, since we both love talking about that, so talk about the different classes a little bit, and some of the newer stuff we'll get to that is really exciting.
So statins have been a mainstay for a long time, but they're definitively one of the greatest risk factor lowering agents we have. I mean, if it weren't for statins, the rate of heart attacks would have been much higher, and the survivability would be much lower. As much as they're vilified in the blogosphere, remember where your blog is coming from. Very often it's just people that have had a bad effect that they think may be from that statin and may not be. But the statins are pretty incredible. They've increased survivability markedly. So then we started looking at that may not be enough, and we started looking at many other things like bile acid sequestrants, which are not used very much anymore, but they're used, and they have a benefit. This kind of blocks absorption of cholesterol. We've used things like ezetimibe, which definitively blocks in the gut wall, and you've got to be a hyperabsorber for this to work very well, and most people are a mix, make cholesterol and absorb, but it blocks absorption of cholesterol, so it has a big benefit in lowering that level. Niacin was big 20, 30 years ago, and we found that it didn't really help. It didn't show any good outcomes.
Once you give them a statin, it worked if they weren't on a statin.
Right. and there may be a place for it, but the side effects are marked with it. Somebody like Dr. Koren, who's light-haired, blonde, light-skinned, blue-eyed, will look like a beet if he takes it. And I, maybe a little darker complexion, may not flush. But women think it's a great revenge because then their husbands understand what menopause feels like.
Where can I get some of that?
But it's interesting. So niacin is a very interesting product because it's, quote, natural. It's a vitamin.
Right.
But it actually can be much more toxic than prescription drugs if not used correctly. I've seen people that have had incredible liver damage from overuse of niacin. So keep in mind that even, quote, vitamins and natural remedies are also chemicals that can have adverse effects if they're not used properly.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Yeah. And you got to know how the compounds make, because each compound is a little different. And so it becomes into even natural compounds have a pharmacological way how they're made or they're produced, and they may not be all equal. And, we've lost that art of knowing that in a certain season it may be more potent, in other seasons it may not be. And we're not really regulating what we're harvesting and how we're making these products. So, I mean, they have a benefit, but we have to be careful how we use them.
Right. So what we've learned, statins are truly remarkable. It's the most important class of drugs that's ever been developed. And just the easiest way to think about that for the public is that statins were introduced in the U.S. market in 1987. And from 1987 through the next 20 years, there was a dramatic decrease in cardiovascular disease throughout the country, including here in Duval County. Actually, a 50% reduction in cardiovascular disease deaths over about 30 years, driven in large part by statins. Obviously, things got better in the cath lab, and the emergency rooms are doing better, and so there's other improvements.
More exercising, changing how they eat.
Right.
Yes.
So there was a lot of things that were happening. People were smoking less, but the biggest contributor to that is statins. So it's really, really quite remarkable. But even with that, statins have some limitations. So the best of the statins gets your LDL cholesterol, your bad cholesterol, down by about 50%. And a lot of people need more than that. But the other thing that we learned about statins, and again, from doing clinical trials and looking at the evidence, is that the way they work is by upregulating the LDL receptor. So Dr. Lopez and I, we have big smiles on our face because we can talk about
you guys are going to geek out on me now, aren't you?
But it's important, and I think we can make it understandable. So the LDL receptor is the part of the liver. It's on the cells, on liver cells, that removes bad cholesterol from the circulation. Okay? So remember, we've talked about this before, is that cholesterol in your circulation is not what you need, it's what you're trying to get rid of. And so your liver helps you get rid of that, and the LDL receptor is the main mechanism. Is the main mechanism for doing that in the human body, and statins help your liver do that. But there are limitations, and we learned that the limitations are surrounding this molecule called PCSK9. And PCSK9 is a counterbalance to the LDL receptor. So when you have too much PCSK9, the number of LDL receptors goes down. So you want to get rid of PCSK9. And when you take a statin, even though your LDL receptors are pulling more cholesterol out, it also increases PCSK9. But the beauty is that we now have drugs that target PCSK9. And if you use those drugs, in addition to statins, now you're lowering LDL cholesterol by 80%.
Wow.
So it's truly remarkable what we can do.
And they have outcomes.
Absolutely.
So it's one thing to lower it, and then there's not a benefit to you physiologically, but they actually drop the reduction of risk for stroke, heart attack, peripheral arterial disease of the legs, carotid disease as well. And they reduce other factors besides just LDL cholesterol, which are also risk factors, like Lp(a) or ApoB or other things as well.
Exactly. And that's a very, very important concept. So we know that LDL is bad when it's circulating at high levels. We know getting rid of it is good. But what Dr. Lopez is alluding to, when you look at a new drug, does it have offsetting effects that make the goodness go away? Or that in total that it's more bad than good.
Right.
And that's why we have to do clinical trials to look at that. And for the PCSK9 inhibitors, as pointed out, we know they do more good than bad. In fact, they're incredibly, these new drugs are incredibly focused on just neutralizing the bad protein and having virtually no other effects. With our understanding of genetics and these new type of drugs, we're now targeting the bad guy in exquisite ways that we're not able to do previously. And so it's really just remarkable technology.
It is. Now, someone who's had a heart attack and didn't have any cholesterol issues or anything going into the heart attack episode, when they come out, are they more than likely on a statin?
Either way. So we see this very often in diabetics. So diabetics typically in their cholesterol profile don't have a high, quote unquote, bad cholesterol, LDL cholesterol. LDL may be normal or slightly elevated. So then how come does a diabetic have 6 times higher risk of a heart attack and stroke? And that in the statin has a benefit, even if they have normal cholesterol, because it still reduces their risk by 50% on average. So yes, it's important either way to be on the statin because it does reduce that risk markedly, first or second, first event or second event, right? So either prevention or secondary prevention, not letting it happen a second time.
Is that a lifetime drug?
It is a lifetime drug because it's not just lowering is very important, but it has this, again, as Dr. Koren said, pleiotropic effects where it drops down inflammation, arterial inflammation, it drops down LDL itself even to a lower level. And the question we're getting to years ago in the medical community is that it used to be that 200 or 250 was okay for total cholesterol. Now we really don't look at total cholesterol so much except for ratios. The LDL now it used to be, 160 was okay. Then it was 130 is okay. Now 100 is okay. Now it's actually 70. And if you look at the European data, it's 55. And we're moving to that very closely. And Dr. Koren and I both like to see it close to 40 or 50, not even 70.
Yeah, just think of LDL cholesterol as something your body has to get rid of. You don't need LDL cholesterol for your cells to function. Every cell in the body has the capability of making its own cholesterol. And the cholesterol in the circulation is stuff you're trying to get rid of. So it's the easiest way to think about it. But again, bringing this back to our first segment and our original point, if you've had a heart attack and a stroke and you're not on a statin, there's a problem.
Right.
Now, either you may be allergic to it, or you may have some, which is very rare, by the way. Almost no one's allergic to statins, but you should question that. So if you've had a heart attack and stroke, the first thing is, are your lipids optimally controlled? Now, you may not have an LDL problem. There are other lipid problems, as we alluded to, that have different solutions. So there is this type of dyslipidemia that has very low HDL cholesterol and high triglycerides, which gets treated a little bit differently, but still a lot of those people are going to be on statin as well. So you should be dealing with a team that is very focused on your lipid situation if you've had a heart attack and a stroke. And if you're not on a lipid-altering agent after that, I would raise questions. I think you'd probably agree with that.
Oh, definitely. And I think we have a bigger armamentarium now. We have more drugs to treat, even if, and I agree with you, I think the statin intolerance or not tolerability of using a statin is much lower than what's reported, because a lot of people just won't take it. They've blocked their mind, or physicians just get tired and just say, well, whatever, I'll just not use it. And very often, a good example is I had a lady who lives on an acre and a half. She has a lot of trees on. And it was very hot here in Jacksonville, and she sat most of the summer. Well, the fall came, and the leaves were falling, and she decides to rake an acre and a half in one day. And of course, the muscle aches were due to the statin, not because she raked for 8 hours, and she had been sitting for 5 months. I mean, heck, I exercise all the time, and I would be achy for raking 8 hours.
Yeah.
And so, of course, it was the statin. So, how do you approach this? And this is the novel idea of the art of medicine. I took her off for 2 weeks. Let the muscle aches resolve. And the data does show 80% of the people that come off a statin reinstitute it are tolerant of it. And if they're not, then there's some data that says maybe we can use CoQ10 or not. Well, it's a whole nother story, but she could take it again. And she was so happy because she knew she was protected, but she didn't get muscle aches.
So this is the difference between the internal medicine approach and the cardiology approach. He gave her 2 weeks off of statins. I would have hired a yard service.
We are talking about MedEvidence, truth behind the data, what to do after a heart attack or stroke. Dr. Albert Lopez and Dr. Michael Koren. Gentlemen, we talked a lot. And I just want to tell you this, Dr. Koren, your team, you like to study the research of research, which ways of improving site performance, recruitment, and operational efficiencies, right?
Yes.
So what are some of the specifics in research that we can talk about with this topic today?
Sure. Well, this is what I do day to day, is look at research studies. And when we talk about the research of research, it's ways of doing research more efficiently. So this podcast would be an example of it. So of course, one of our motivations is to get the word out about some of the great research that's happening in our communities. And there's been a change in the way research has been done over the last 30 years. 30 years ago, most of the research was done in big academic medical centers, but now more and more research is moving out to community-based settings, and we're part of that trend. So when we talk about the research of research, that's telling people about what is available in the community. And so we're excited about that, and great physicians like Dr. Lopez, who is works day to day taking care of patients and doing his thing, can also be part of research because of the infrastructure and the resources that we have at the research centers here in Northeast Florida and other places around the state. So that's part of the research of research.
Did you know how I got involved with Dr. Koren?
I do not.
So, we've known each other for a long time, and every time I went to a talk that Dr. Koren did, he says, you really need to work with me. And, I was in the trenches. Yeah, I don't have time. I can't do it. For 20 years, he hounded me. And so finally, at one point, I sat down in my bucket list, and said, what have you always wanted to do? And I said, I really want to be instrumental in doing new research and new data. And because I read it all the time, it would be fun if I could do it, but I'm not in a university setting, so my chances are zero. And then the light bulb went up in my head, said, let me talk to Dr. Koren. And it's actually it's only about a fifth of my week, and it encompasses about 80% of my joy because it's really exciting. It's great nerdisms, and I get to do a lot of fun things and really think, and help people. But I want you to talk about the level of research we do. Dr. Koren has been published several times, as you've mentioned, but recently he just published an international study on Lp(a), which is one of my bugaboos, and we've known about this little protein for 20 years, but we've had nothing that we had things that lowered it, like vitamin C, but it showed no benefit. So why take something if it doesn't have a benefit in reducing risk, right? And doesn't reduce events. But he has a paper, international paper, that helped reduce LP little a 90%, which is incredible, because this is a modifiable risk factor in 20% of the general population. So imagine if we can reduce cardiovascular disease by 20%.
Wow.
Internationally. That's an incredible thought. And, Dr. Koren is part of that. And he won't tell you that, but I'll tell you that because I'm really proud to be on this team.
Well, that's why he's in the lab coat and you're in the suit.
Well, at my age, I'll do anything to look good.
Well, I appreciate those kind words. I thought the only one that actually read my work was my mom. But I guess there are a couple other people out there that do read it. Even my mom couldn't get through my paper.
Actually, it's kind of interesting.
But it is cool. I agree. Is that these are things that we couldn't modify at all. And now we have these new products that understand the genetics of how these proteins are being developed and can actually block them to degrees that we were unimaginable just 5 years ago. So it's really, really exciting.
And let me just take a little 30-second because, we talked, everybody knows something about messenger RNA because of the vaccines, but you have DNA, which is what we are. And then messenger RNA comes up and it's kind of like the guy who reads the template, right? Who reads the architectural plans, and then it starts manufacturing. Well, this drug snipers one little protein. It doesn't affect anything else on it. It stops one protein that makes this compound, which is very dangerous. It's pro-clotting. It looks like clotting factor. It causes systemic inflammation, arterial inflammation. It increases risk of aortic stenosis at a very early age, and it doubles and triples the risk of cardiovascular disease, arterial disease of the legs, and carotid disease, even people with normal cholesterol, which is kind of crazy. And it may have had a function in the past, but irrespective of that, it doesn't really have a good function in modern society.
Right.
But imagine that we're in sci-fi times, we're in Star Trek times, we're in Guardians of the Galaxy times where we are doing incredible technology today. And it's so cool to be part of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the other thing that's cool is that people who are listening to this and people in our community can be part of it right now. So we're actually enrolling in programs that involve using these products. So these products have been developed at our center starting in first-in-human studies. We're doing first-in-human studies as we speak on these new products that are targeting lipoprotein a. And we also have phase 3 projects where people can know that the drug has been used already in hundreds or 1,000 people, and they're part of the next wave to show that it can work in tens of thousands of people and ultimately be part of the process of getting these things on the market. It's funny, I had a really interesting conversation with a patient just yesterday, and he was involved in the studies with Praluent, which is one of the PCSK9 inhibitors. And I happen to be the second author of the first phase 2 study for that particular product. And he was in that study. And he didn't really have awareness of that. He knew that he was in a research study, and he knew that it works really, really well. But he didn't really know that he had an integral part of developing that drug. So it didn't quite connect with him. And I mentioned that. I said, you're one of the reasons why you're able to take it now. And he said, wow, I never thought about that.
Yeah.
So it's actually an important motivation for people. You can really make a difference. It's a legacy for you. It's a legacy for your family. And it's how you impact the world. So participating in clinical research is, really a joy for me. It's an honor, and it's a neat thing for our patients. And I love to get patients interested and involved in it.
Yeah, I mean, and because of that, clinical trial research is how the COVID vaccine was able to be pushed as quickly as it was to everyone. Here
in Northeast Florida, we had a huge impact on that. We had 1,500 people get investigational vaccines before the rest of the world had access to them. Mm-hmm. So it's really a neat part of promoting clinical research here in our community.
Yeah, and what about the technology? You mentioned it too. What about the technology? What's the future looking like?
Well, let's get into some of the specifics. So we talked about LPA. You want to talk a little bit about oxidized LDL?
Sure.
It's another area that's of interest.
This is an area that I've been looking at for over 20 years. And, the story for me was that having a patient that had recurrent stents put in, heart attacks, mini strokes, and I got very frustrated. So I started looking at different things in his lipid profile that would affect it. And looking at these advanced lipids, I found certain factors that we found that he had less stents going on after about 2 years of changing therapy, because it allowed me to modify therapy according to what were his risk factors. And then the technology came out to look at oxidized LDL. And so if you imagine LDL is just a substrate, a piece of metal, right? And if you think of your arterial wall like a volcano, lava just has to be activated in order for that volcano to erupt. A piece of metal has to be rusted in order to or oxidized to become rusted, right? So if you think of that arterial wall as being rusted before it ruptures, oxidized LDL is the product of this bad cholesterol being activated or oxidized, and now it's a risk factor of cardiovascular disease. So we've seen people with high LDLs or moderate LDLs, and they don't have events. But if it's oxidized, they're making plaque, period. So you can look at very early on, years ahead, if you're looking at oxidized LDL. So how do you prevent? And one of my big mottos is, we can throw all kinds of therapies. We will not stop cardiovascular disease until we really focus on prevention. And this is a good way of looking at prevention. We're doing it way, way upstream, right? Not after the event happens, like we're talking about. But we now have drugs that can do that and look at oxidized LDL.
Yeah, so again, oxidized LDL is an LDL molecule, which is LDL is a combination of fat and protein that circulates into the way our body gets rid of the extra cholesterol and the extra fat. And when it's oxidized, there's a chemical change that's occurred that makes it more dangerous. But there's actually this interesting correlation between oxidized LDL and lipoprotein(a), which is that our LDL receptors have a hard time getting rid of these things. So as I mentioned, the LDL receptor is the main way that our body gets rid of the bad cholesterol. But if it's oxidized or if it's in the form of lipoprotein(a), our LDL receptors don't get rid of it very well. And so it lingers. And when it lingers, then there are other parts of our body that try to get rid of it. And the part of our body that tries to get rid of oxidized LDL are called macrophages. And that leads to inflammation and other problems, which ultimately creates plaques on the arteries. So it's nasty.
Yeah.
It's nasty.
It's just building up and building up.
But the good news is that with technology, we now can come up with therapies that target oxidized LDL specifically. And of course, as we speak, we're doing a clinical trial. We're actually working with the TIMI group at Harvard on this particular trial.
I didn't realize the TIMI group. That's pretty cool. So that's an instrumental study that 30 years ago, Mike? TIMI, the original TIMI study?
Yeah,
TIMI 1, TIMI 2. It's a 30-year-old study that initiated then, but we've kind of moved that study along over 30 years and showed improvement upon improvement upon improvement. Yeah. I'm sorry, but it's fascinating.
That's interesting.
Yeah, well, that's a personal thing because actually the reason I'm a cardiologist is because of TIMI. I actually got to see the first TIMI trials. I don't want to say what year it was because it'll date me.
Age is just a number, just a number.
Right.
But I heard you tried to change your middle name to TIMI.
I did, but that's
just checking.
Yeah,
was Timmy a guy, or
we're not talking
okay, we're not going there. Okay.
Well, we can get to that in a second. But the acronym. But before we get too off track,
the acronym. Okay.
It's an acronym for a group out of Harvard that was actually started by Dr. Eugene Braunwald, who's a very famous cardiologist.
Okay.
Who's actually one of my mentors when I was in medical school. So I got to know him.
All right, Timmy. All right.
And it stands. It's to limit myocardial infarction is basically what it is. And that's what it stands for, myocardial infarction being the word for heart attack. But anyhow, we are working with that group, and they're up to their 80th trial or something, and it's called TIMI 1 versus TIMI 80 because this is the 80th trial within this series of trials. But nonetheless, we actually have a product that targets oxidized LDL, and we're looking at it specifically for people that have had a previous heart attack. And we think that this may be a really fascinating way to limit the damage from LDL. Particularly, as Dr. Lopez mentioned, our ability to lower LDL is really pretty robust right now, but it's much more difficult to get to these bad actors of Lp(a) and oxidized LDL, and now we can.
So it's interesting, no matter what you do, you can't lower Lp(a). It's there. So you can exercise, it doesn't change it. You can be on a statin, it doesn't make it better. You can eat grass, it's not going to change it.
How do you know you have it?
You have to get tested.
Okay.
And there's a big push in certain...
But I thought CBD can do everything. But you said you...
Well, either that or you just don't care. But
you mentioned eating grass, so I just...
Yul Gibbons is... But, the young adults don't know who Yul Gibbons is anymore.
That's true.
But...
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just like, how do you even know you have Lp(a)?
We think that everybody should...
Yeah.
It's a lab test, and everybody should be tested for Lp(a), especially in certain populations. People that have early heart disease family history or themselves have early heart disease, carotid disease, stroke, arterial disease of their legs, or have aortic stenosis should be tested. But there's a push among certain people think that everybody should be tested. And if everybody should be tested, when do you test somebody when they're 10, or do you test them when they're 20? Do you test them when they're 60? That's been an ongoing argument. So there's 3 camps. Everybody should be tested. Those camps only if you have risk factors. And those camps that said, well, yes, we should be tested, but it should be done at an adolescence or pre-adolescent age. So yeah, it's very, very interesting about that. But there are things that will change oxidized LDL. So we know that pre-diabetics and diabetics have a higher level of oxidized LDL. We know exercise drops ox LDL. We know eating clean foods, non-processed foods, non-high saturated fat, not fatty foods, right? Good fats versus bad fats. Those bad fatty foods, a lot of fried foods, a lot of foods with
bacon. If you want to raise your oxidized LDL, eat bacon.
As much as I love bacon, what made me stop eating bacon was that I'm cheap, and it really made me angry that 80% of what I'm eating is fat, and I'm not going to really do anything with it. The second thing was that the cancer risk with it drove me crazy, and then the heart disease risk is awful. And I said, I'll find other ways to make
the chemicals that are used to process it also increase oxidized LDL.
Yeah. And so there are things that we can do, but sometimes it's not enough to do the natural ways of, exercise and eating a cleaner lifestyle or eating less sugar. Sometimes you need to use something that will drop it even more, especially if you've had an event, right? So it's all about preventing the first event, but even more so preventing the second event.
Right. So, sort of wrap up, getting back to research and getting back to our first point about people who've had a heart attack and stroke, there are many, many ways we can help them. And literally, we just scratched the surface with the last hour of discussion. But what's important to know is that you work with your team. You talk about the fact that there are very, very established ways of making a difference and reducing your risk. And also look at research options, because there's a lot of things that we can approach that were not approachable even a few years ago, and research is a good opportunity. It could be through lipids. It could be through reducing congestive heart failure worsening, which is when your heart muscle gets weak because of a heart attack. It could be related to your inability to get off cigarettes, and we have smoking cessation studies. So there's a variety of ways that you can make yourself, put yourself into a better position to reduce your risk over the future.
We and you have been instrumental. ENCORE Research has been a hidden gem in this community. We work with bempedoic acid. That drug is out now. We work with inclisiran. That drug is out now. We work with the PCSK9. So it's both of those drugs, right, which you were published in that paper, as you mentioned before, more than one publication on that. So this research center has been instrumental in huge amount of research for a long time. Right. And because of this research, we have drugs that are on the market today that are helping people.
And it's not just drugs. We're actually working on a project right now on an app that you put on your phone that helps identify if you're developing congestive heart failure. So I'll leave you with the idea that although it's not modifiable to get people off their cell phones, it is modifiable what we put on the cell phones.
There you go.
I'm your host, Michelle McCormick, and we want to thank Dr. Michael Koren for his clinical and research perspective behind the science in this episode of MedEvidence, the truth behind the data.